There is a film reel sitting on my desk tonight, round, metal, dented along one edge, with a paper label glued to the lid. The handwriting is careful, almost decorative, in faded blue ink. The label says one word and 1 year, Pulgasari, 1985. I have been holding this reel for about 40 minutes now, friend, turning it slowly in my hands, and I want you to understand something before we open it. This reel was made by a man who was kidnapped. The director who shot it had been pulled off a beach in Hong Kong and dragged across the Yellow Sea in the hold of a freighter. The lead actress had been taken 6 months earlier, off a different beach, in a different ambush, by men working for the same employer. They both made this movie under the personal supervision of the second most powerful person in their captor country. And the man giving the orders was not a producer, not a studio executive, not a state minister. He was the heir to a dynasty. He was 36 years old when he stole them, and he loved cinema more than anything else on earth. His name was Kim Jong-il. And before this reel is finished telling its story, you and I are going to walk through 8 years of the strangest abduction in modern history. We are going to meet a director who refused to work and was buried in a prison camp until he agreed. We are going to meet an actress who survived by writing letters to a husband she did not know was 3 kilometers away. We are going to meet a Japanese stuntman in a rubber monster suit, an Austrian taxi driver who saved 2 lives in March of 1986, and a dictator who owned 30,000 films and could not make a good one to save his soul. I am Mortimer Quill. The reel is open. Walk with me. To understand why a man kidnaps a filmmaker, you have to understand what kind of childhood produces that idea. And Kim Jong-il had the strangest childhood any boy in 20th century Asia ever had. He was born in 1941 or 1942, the records disagree, and the official version places the birth on a sacred mountain under a double rainbow, which tells you everything you need to know about how the family handled facts. His father, Kim Il-sung, was a guerrilla leader who would soon become the founding dictator of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. His mother died when he was 7. His younger brother drowned in a swimming pool, possibly while the boys were playing together, and Kim Jong-il never spoke about it again for the rest of his life. What he had instead of a normal life was things. Astonishing, hoarded, fortress-guarded things. By the time he was 12 years old, he had a private cinema in the family compound in Pyongyang with a projection booth and red velvet seats and a personal projectionist who lived on site. By the time he was 20, that cinema was being fed by a film library that grew at the rate of several hundred reels a year, smuggled in through diplomatic pouches, purchased through front companies in Hong Kong and East Berlin, gifted by Soviet ambassadors who wanted to stay in the family's good graces. By the time he reached his 30s, that personal collection had grown to roughly 30,000 films. Hollywood pictures from the 1940s, French New Wave, Italian neorealism, Japanese samurai epics, James Bond movies, Friday the 13th slashers, every Elizabeth Taylor film ever made because he had a particular fixation on her. He watched movies the way other men of his class might collect wine or hunting rifles. Constantly, voraciously, with detailed handwritten notes on cinematography and editing and lighting choices. And here is the part that nobody outside North Korea took seriously for a long time. He was not a casual viewer. He studied. In 1973, when he was 31 years old and being groomed by his father to take over the propaganda apparatus, Kim Jong-il sat down and wrote a book. The book was called On the Art of Cinema. It was published in Pyongyang in a hardcover edition with a portrait of the author looking thoughtful, and it ran to almost 300 pages. I have read this book, friend. I have a copy somewhere in the lower archive, the one where the propaganda materials live in their own ventilated cabinet. And I have to tell you something uncomfortable. The book is not stupid. It is heavily ideological, of course. Every page bends toward the worship of his father and the cult of the Korean people. But mixed in with the propaganda is genuine, technical, sometimes insightful film theory. Kim Jong-il understood the difference between a long take and a tracking shot. He understood why eyeline matches matter in dialogue scenes. He had opinions on lighting that any cinematographer would recognize as informed. He cared about cinema in the way only an obsessive can. By the middle of the 1970s, he had been put in charge of the entire North Korean film industry. The studios in Pyongyang reported to him directly. Scripts crossed his desk. Casting decisions waited for his approval. Posters were shown to him before they were printed. And under his direction, the industry produced about 40 feature films a year, all of them propaganda. All of them following the official aesthetic doctrine called the Juche film theory. All of them, and this was the part that drove him mad. Terrible. He could see they were terrible. He had 30,000 foreign films at home. He knew what real cinema looked like. He knew the rhythm of a Coppola edit, the breath of a Kurosawa frame, the patient camera of a Bergman scene. And he watched his own studios churn out wooden, didactic, lifeless propaganda, starring actors who had been trained to gesticulate like opera singers, and directors who had been instructed to film everything from a flat, eye-level wide shot because anything else might be considered formalist deviation. He complained. He fired people. He rewrote scripts. He built a special studio called Korean Film Studio No. 7 and stocked it with the best equipment money could buy. None of it helped. The films stayed bad. The actors stayed wooden. The directors stayed scared. Because in a country where one wrong frame could send your entire family to a labor camp, no artist was going to take a creative risk for any reason whatsoever. And here, friend, is where the story turns. Here is the moment where the obsession of a privileged child collides with the absolute power of a state apparatus and produces something that no other dictator in history had quite tried before. Kim Jong-il decided that if he could not make his own filmmakers good, he would import good filmmakers from elsewhere, by force. He drew up a list. The list had several names on it. Some of those names belonged to people in Japan. Some belonged to people in Hong Kong. But the two names at the top of the list belonged to two very specific people from South Korea who had once been married to each other and who were among the most famous figures in the entire Korean cultural world. The first name was Choi Eun-hee, the actress. The second name was Shin Sang-ok, the director. We are going to meet them now, and then we are going to watch what happens when a dictator decides that the cure for a bad movie is a kidnapping. Choi Eun-hee was born in 1926 in a small town outside Seoul. Her family was poor, her father drank, her mother held the household together with the kind of stubbornness that runs in women who have no other choices. Choi started acting in her late teens, in stage productions in Seoul during the Japanese occupation, and by the time the Korean War broke out in 1950, she was already known. By the late 1950s, she was a star. By the mid-1960s, she was the most famous actress in South Korea, the face on 1,000 posters, the woman whose photograph hung in every barbershop window from Busan to the demilitarized zone. She had played queens and farmers' wives and modern career women and tragic concubines, and audiences trusted her face the way they trusted their own grandmothers' faces. She was Korean cinema in a very real and specific sense. Shin Sang-ok was born in 1926 as well. He grew up in what is now North Korea, in a town called Cheongjin, and he came south during the chaos of the war. He studied art in Tokyo, fell in love with American gangster films, and by the time he was 30, he was directing his own movies in Seoul. By his mid-30s, he ran his own production company called Shin Film, and Shin Film was the dominant studio in the country. He directed about 70 features in his career. He produced over 300. He was known for working fast, for shooting in difficult locations, for refusing to let government censors scare him into bad cuts. South Korean filmmakers called him the Tiger of Chungmuro, after the street where the studios clustered, because he never backed down from a fight. Choi and Shin met on a film set in 1953. They married a few years later. For about 2 decades, they were the most glamorous couple in Asian cinema, the king and queen of Chungmuro, photographed at premieres and fundraisers and award ceremonies, raising 2 adopted children, running the studio together, fighting often and loudly and publicly. They divorced in 1976. The divorce was bitter. The studio collapsed shortly afterward, partly because of the personal split, and partly because the South Korean military government had revoked Shin's filmmaking license over a series of disputes about censorship. By 1977, both of them were professionally adrift. Choi was running a small acting school in Seoul-land, trying to put together a small theater company. Shin was in self-imposed exile, drifting between Hong Kong and Los Angeles, looking for work that nobody wanted to give him because the South Korean government had quietly let it be known that anyone who hired him would have problems with their own permits. This is the moment Kim Jong-il's people were waiting for. A famous artist at the lowest point of her career, a famous director with no studio and no visa and no friends in power. Both of them separately desperate, both of them, crucially, separated from each other, and therefore unlikely to compare notes if approached with an offer. The approach came to Choi first. In the autumn of 1977, a businesswoman named Madam Wang reached out from Hong Kong with an interesting proposal. There was a film company in Hong Kong, the woman said, that wanted to discuss casting Choi in a major production. The fee would be substantial. The travel would be paid. All she had to do was come to Hong Kong and have a meeting. Choi, who needed money badly, said yes. She flew to Hong Kong in January of 1978. She checked into a hotel. She had a series of pleasant meetings with Madam Wang and various producers and what appeared to be lawyers. The deal seemed real. The contract was being drawn up. And on the afternoon of January 14th, Madam Wang invited her on a casual outing. A drive out to Repulse Bay, a famous beach on the south side of Hong Kong Island, just to relax before signing the papers. When the car arrived at the beach, Madam Wang excused herself for a moment. Choi got out, walked toward the water, looked at the waves. A motorboat was anchored about 30 meters offshore. 2 men in plain clothes approached her from behind. They did not say anything. They did not need to. One of them put a hand over her mouth. The other lifted her off the sand. Within 90 seconds, she was on the motorboat, and within 20 minutes, the motorboat was alongside a larger freighter, and within 48 hours, that freighter was anchored off the North Korean port of Nampo, and Choi Eun-hee, the most famous actress in South Korea, was being walked down a gangway into the personal welcome of a man she had only seen in photographs. He was waiting for her at the bottom of the gangway. Short, thick-set, bouffant hair already going gray at the edges, oversized tinted glasses, a beige Mao suit cut to flatter his frame. He smiled when he saw her, the smile of a fan who has finally met his idol, and he extended his hand. "Madam Choi," Kim Jong-il said, "thank you for coming. I am very, very sorry about the means, but I am so glad you are here." She did not faint. She did not scream. She had spent 30 years on film sets, learning how to keep her face still under any pressure, and she used every gram of that training in the next 60 seconds. She let him shake her hand. She let him guide her to a black sedan. She let him make small talk on the drive into Pyongyang about the weather and the scenery and her recent work, as if they were 2 acquaintances meeting at a film festival. But behind her face, Choi Eun-hee was doing one calculation over and over, the same calculation any kidnapped person does in the first hour of captivity. She was calculating where her husband was, or rather, her ex-husband. Because Shin Sang-ok was the only person in the world who could possibly understand what was happening to her, and he was 4,000 kilometers away, in another country, on another continent, completely unaware that she had just been swallowed by the strangest fan in modern history. She did not know it yet, friend, but Kim Jong-il had a calculation of his own. He needed her, yes, but he needed her partly as bait, because the second name on his list was waiting to be triggered, and the trigger was Choi herself. 6 months later, in July of 1978, Shin Sang-ok received a phone call in Hong Kong. The caller was a contact who claimed to know what had happened to his ex-wife. There were leads, the caller said. There were people in Hong Kong who could help. If Shin would just come for a meeting. Shin came for the meeting. Shin walked into the same trap, on the same beach, with the same outcome.
By the end of July, the second freighter was crossing the Yellow Sea, and the second gangway was being walked, and Kim Jong-il was greeting his second guest with the same warm smile and the same apologetic words. But here, friend, the script changes. Choi had survived her abduction by going still, by playing the long game, by giving Kim nothing to push against. Shin Sang-ok looked at the dictator across the receiving line, looked at the men holding rifles behind him, looked at the welcome banner painted in gold characters above the harbor, and decided that he was not going to play. He refused to bow. He refused to thank his host. He refused when the smiling young man asked him over dinner whether he would like to begin work on a screenplay tomorrow morning to give any answer at all. That refusal cost him 4 years of his life. He was sent to prison camp number 6 in the mountains north of Pyongyang. The camp was not the kind of place that appeared on tourist maps or in foreign reports. It was a closed political facility surrounded by triple barbed wire with watchtowers at every corner and dogs in every kennel. The prisoners were a mixture of disgraced party officials, suspected spies, families of defectors, and the occasional foreigner who had refused to cooperate with the state. Shin Sang-ok was the only film director in the population, which made him an item of curiosity, but did not exempt him from any of the standard procedures. The standard procedures were these: wake at 4 in the morning, stand for inspection in the cold for 40 minutes, receive a bowl of rice and salt, always rice, always with salt, never with anything else. Spend the day either at hard labor or in a small concrete room memorizing the collected works of Kim Il-sung, page by page, until you could recite them from memory in front of a guard who would slap you if you missed a comma. In the evening, another bowl of rice and salt. Then, sleep on a wooden plank in a barracks where the temperature in winter dropped to about -15 degrees Celsius, and the only heat came from the body warmth of the men packed beside you. Shin tried to escape twice. The first time, in the autumn of 1979, he managed to get over the outer wire and run for about 3 kilometers before the dogs caught him. The second time, in the spring of 1980, he made it almost to a road. Both times he was returned to the camp, beaten and placed in solitary confinement for several months. The solitary confinement cell was approximately 1 meter square. He could not stand fully upright. He could not lie fully flat. He recited Kim Il-sung's collected works to himself, in the dark, to keep his mind from breaking. He lost 40 kilograms in those 4 years. He lost most of his teeth. He lost the use of one of his ears, which got infected and never healed properly. But he did not lose his refusal. He never agreed to make a film for the regime. Whenever a guard asked him whether he had reconsidered, whether he was ready to apologize and begin work, Shin would shake his head and say nothing. The guards reported this monthly to Pyongyang. Pyongyang waited. What Shin did not know, and could not have known, was that Choi Eun-hee was during those same 4 years living in a guest house in central Pyongyang. She had her own staff. She had her own car. She had a library of films selected for her by Kim Jong-il personally. She was not free. No, she could not leave the country, could not contact her family, could not refuse to attend the cultural events Kim wanted her at, but she was treated like a guest. Even like a colleague. Kim came to her guest house for dinner twice a month. He talked to her about cinema. He showed her scripts. He asked her opinion on actresses. He told her, repeatedly and apparently sincerely, that he considered her one of the great artists of her generation and that her presence in Pyongyang was an honor for the entire country. Choi played along. She had no choice, but she also calculated that survival required engagement. She wrote letters home that were never delivered. She kept a hidden diary in tiny script in the margins of approved books. She waited. And every few months she asked Kim, very gently, whether he had any news of her ex-husband, whom she heard had also come to North Korea. Kim always smiled and said the situation was complicated, that her ex-husband was being difficult, that perhaps in time, things would resolve themselves. In the early months of 1983, things resolved themselves. Shin Sang-ok was pulled out of prison camp number 6 on a morning in February. He had not been told why. He was given a hot bath, the first one in 4 years. He was given new clothes, a suit and tie that hung loose on his starved frame. He was driven to Pyongyang in a black sedan with curtained windows. He was brought to a banquet hall in a government compound with chandeliers and white tablecloths and waiters in white gloves, and he was seated at a long table next to an empty chair. After about 10 minutes, the empty chair was filled. A woman sat down beside him. He turned his head and looked at her, and for several seconds he could not speak, because the woman beside him was Choi Eun-hee, the wife he had divorced 7 years earlier in another country, alive and well-dressed, and looking at him with an expression he could not read. Across the table, Kim Jong-il was beaming. He raised a glass of champagne. He said something about reunions, about the healing power of cinema, about the great work that the three of them were going to do together. Shin and Choi did not speak. They did not embrace. They sat side by side in shock, and they understood without exchanging a single word that the prison sentence was over and the contract was about to begin. Kim's terms, when he laid them out over the following weeks, were astonishing. The two of them would be remarried, a formality, but a formality the dictator wanted observed. They would be given their own film studio inside the existing North Korean film apparatus called Shin Film, after Shin's old company in Seoul. They would have an unlimited budget. They would have access to any equipment they wanted, imported from anywhere in the world, no questions asked. They would have freedom of movement inside North Korea and, eventually, freedom to travel abroad to film festivals and shoots accompanied by minders. In exchange, they would make films. Good films. Films that Kim Jong-il could be proud of. Films that would put North Korean cinema on the world map. Shin agreed. He agreed for one reason and one reason only, and he later said this very clearly to investigators after his escape. He agreed because Choi was now hostage to his behavior. If he refused to work, she would suffer. If he tried to escape alone, she would be killed. The 4 years in the camp had taught him exactly what the regime was capable of, and he was not going to test it with his ex-wife's life on the table. But under that agreement, in the secret architecture of his mind, he was also planning. Because Shin Sang-ok was a director, and directors think in long arcs. From the day of the banquet onward, he began constructing, slowly, patiently, over years, the conditions that might one day let him and Choi walk out together. He needed access to foreign currency. He needed minders who trusted him. He needed a foreign trip with the right combination of distance and chaos. None of these things existed yet. All of them could be built. In the meantime, he had a job, and the job, against every expectation, turned out to be the most productive period of his entire career. Between 1983 and 1986, Shin Sang-ok directed 7 feature films inside North Korea. Choi Eun-hee starred in most of them. They worked at a pace that would have been considered fast in Hollywood and was considered miraculous in the slow, committee-bound North Korean industry. They had crews of hundreds. They had military extras whenever a battle scene required them. They had whole villages closed off for location shoots. They had every piece of equipment they asked for, including 35mm cameras smuggled in from West Germany, lighting rigs from Japan, sound equipment from Switzerland. The films they made in those 3 years were genuinely strange. They were better than anything North Korea had produced before. They had real performances, real cinematography, real story structures borrowed from the international cinema Shin had spent his career studying. But they were also, all of them, propaganda. Because Kim Jong-il was the executive producer, and Kim Jong-il had political requirements that no script could ignore. There was Runaway, a melodrama set during the Japanese colonial period about a Korean family fleeing oppression. There was Salt, a heavy social drama in which Choi Eun-hee gave one of the strongest performances of her career, playing a peasant woman driven to despair by class injustice. There was Love, Love, My Love, a musical adaptation of a classical Korean folktale
full of songs and bright costumes, the closest thing to entertainment that North Korean audiences had seen in a generation. And then there was Pulgasari. Pulgasari was Kim Jong-il's pet project, the film he wanted more than any of the others. The story was a feudal Korean folktale about a small, magical creature born from a peasant girl's blood that grew larger and larger by eating iron. As the creature grew, it became a force capable of destroying the iron weapons of the corrupt feudal lords, and therefore liberating the peasants. The political allegory was so blunt that nobody had to explain it. But the genre, Giant Monster Destroys Cities, was direct, intentional, and beloved homage to the Japanese kaiju films that Kim had grown up watching, particularly Godzilla. To make Pulgasari look right, Shin and Kim needed expertise that did not exist in North Korea. Specifically, they needed a man in a rubber monster suit who could perform the kind of physical acting that decades of Toho Studios training had refined into an art form. There was exactly one place to get such a man, and that was Japan. The legendary Toho stuntman Kenpachiro Satsuma, who had played Godzilla in several films, was approached through an intermediary and offered an extraordinary fee to come to Pyongyang and play Pulgasari. He was told the production was a China. Hosts deferred to a quiet, smiling man with oversized glasses who watched dailies in a private screening room. Pulgasari was released in 1985. It was a strange film with a real monster suit, real explosions, real military extras playing the feudal armies. It had a coherent story. It had moments that almost worked. It was, in the long history of North Korean cinema, the closest the country ever came to a genuine entertainment film. And it was the project on which Shin Sang-ok began assembling, very quietly, the materials he would need to escape. Because somewhere in those 3 years of intense production, somewhere between the script meetings and the dailies and the late dinners with Kim Jong-il, Shin had started doing something his host had not authorized. He had started recording. The recordings were made on a small cassette recorder that Shin had requested for, supposedly, dialogue note-taking. He had begged for it, claiming he needed it to remember Kim's directorial suggestions. Kim had agreed, with mild amusement, and never thought about it again. Shin began taking the recorder to every private meeting with the dictator, at dinner, at script conferences, at the long late-night conversations in Kim's personal screening room, after the wine had loosened things up. What Shin recorded over those months was extraordinary. Kim Jong-il, the second most powerful person in North Korea, talking openly and at length about why he had kidnapped them, about his frustrations with his own filmmakers, about his ambitions for North Korean cinema on the world stage, about his view of his father, his view of foreign leaders, his strategies for cultural influence. The recordings, if they ever reached the outside world, would be the most damaging political document the regime had ever leaked. They would prove the kidnappings beyond any deniability. They would prove the regime's foreign abduction program. They would expose Kim Jong-il personally, in his own unmistakable voice, admitting to a federal-grade kidnapping in his own words. Shin hid the cassettes inside film cans labeled with technical jargon that would not interest any minder. He stored them in his studio archive, and he waited for the right foreign trip. The right foreign trip came in March of 1986. There was a small film festival in Vienna, Austria, that Kim Jong-il wanted Shin and Choi to attend. The festival was a low-priority event, a regional showcase, not a place where major international press would be paying attention. Kim's calculation was that Shin and Choi could attend, give some interviews, generate some prestige for North Korean cinema, and return without incident. They had attended several smaller festivals before, in Eastern Europe, always under heavy minder supervision, and they had always come back. Kim trusted them. Or rather, Kim trusted that Choi was a sufficient hostage to Shin, and Shin a sufficient hostage to Choi to keep both of them in line. He was wrong. He was wrong because he had finally given them, after years of careful preparation, two things they had never had at the same time before. They were both outside North Korea simultaneously, and they were both carrying, in their luggage, the cassettes. On the morning of March 13, 1986, Shin and Choi attended a press event in central Vienna. Their North Korean minders were nearby, but not directly attached. There was a brief moment of confusion when the press conference broke for refreshments. Shin took Choi's arm. They walked, casually, toward the back exit of the conference building. They emerged onto a side street. They flagged down a taxi. The taxi driver was an older Austrian man whose name has never been fully reconstructed in any account I have read. Shin spoke a few words of broken English. He said one thing very clearly 3 times. United States Embassy. United States Embassy. United States Embassy. The taxi driver looked at his passengers, at the panic in their faces, at the woman who he probably did not recognize as one of the most famous actresses in Asian cinema, and he made a decision that probably saved both their lives. He drove. He drove fast. He did not stop at the lights he could legally have stopped at. He pulled up at the front gate of the American embassy, and Shin and Choi ran across the sidewalk and into the embassy compound, and the gates closed behind them. And within 90 seconds, American Marines were physically blocking the North Korean minders who arrived sprinting on foot from the press conference 6 blocks away. The defection was the largest North Korean cultural defection of the Cold War. The cassettes, when they were finally translated and released, became the foundational evidence for everything the world had suspected and never been able to prove about the North Korean abduction program. Choi and Shin spent the next several years in protective custody in the United States, being debriefed by intelligence agencies from at least 7 countries. They eventually returned to South Korea, where they were treated with a mixture of celebrity, suspicion, and quiet shame. They never made another major film together. Shin Sang-ok died in 2006. Choi Eun-hee died in 2018. They are both buried in Seoul. So what was this whole story about, friend, in the end? It was about a film reel labeled Pulgasari, made in 1985 by people who did not want to make it, for a man who could not make it himself. But it was also about something larger, and I want you to sit with it for a moment before we close the reel. Power, real power, can do almost anything. It can build cities and burn them. It can rewrite the history that gets taught to children. It can make 23 million people stand in formation and weep on cue when a leader dies. It can erase a person from a family photograph and erase the family that remembers the person. There is almost nothing power cannot reach. But power cannot make art. Power can commission art, can buy art, can steal art. Power can build the most expensive film studio in Asia and stock it with cameras imported from West Germany. Power can put any artist in front of any camera and give that artist an unlimited budget. But the actual moment of creation, the moment when a director sees a frame in his head and a camera operator finds it on the lens, and an actor delivers a line that makes a stranger in another country and another century cry, that moment is not something power can command. It happens because a free mind made a choice. And a free mind, by definition, is the one thing a dictator does not possess in his subjects and cannot order into existence by decree. This is why every authoritarian regime in history has had a complicated, jealous, half-worshipful relationship with art. Why Stalin personally read scripts, why Hitler painted alone in his bunker, why Kim Jong-il spent decades curating a private film library and writing books about cinematography. They are not stupid, they know what they cannot do, and that knowledge eats at them. And sometimes, in the case of Kim Jong-il, exactly once that we know of in the late 20th century, that knowledge eats at them so badly that they decide to physically steal the human beings who possess what they cannot. It does not work. It never works. Shin Sang-ok made 7 films in North Korea, and they were better than anything the regime made before or since. But they were not the films Shin would have made if he had been free. They are propaganda with a craftsman's hand on them, no more and no less. The reel I have on my desk tonight, the Pulgasari reel, is not a great film. It is an interesting film, a strange film, a historically important film. But it is not the film that a free Shin Sang-ok would have made in 1985 if he had been working in Seoul
with his old crew, with no minders in the screening room, with no hostage in the next building. Talent is the last territory power cannot conquer. That is the meta lesson of this entire archive entry. When you see a strongman collecting paintings, kidnapping musicians, demanding poems be written about him, building personal cinemas, understand what you are looking at. You are looking at a man who has already won every battle he can win by force, and who is now staring at the one thing his army cannot bring him. He can buy it, he can imitate it, he can, in extreme cases, kidnap it, but he cannot make it appear from nothing in a free mind. Because the free mind is the thing he abolished on his way to power, and now, very late, he finds he needs it back. That is why I keep this reel on my desk tonight, friend. Not because Pulgasari is a masterpiece, it is not, but because it is the artifact of a moment when one of the most powerful men in 20th century Asia tried, with every tool available to a state, to manufacture art by force, and failed, and the people he kidnapped escaped, and the recordings they smuggled out destroyed what was left of his international reputation. The dictator died in 2011. The director and the actress died as free people, in their own country, in their own beds. That is the score, friend. That is how it ended. I am going to put the reel back in its case now. I am going to label it for the lower archive. And before you go, I have something for you. Reach into your coat pocket. There is a small piece of cardstock there. It was not there when you came in. It is a movie ticket. The printing is faded. The date on it is 1985. The location says one word: Pyongyang. Don't lose it, friend. Some tickets, once you accept them, you don't get to hand back. We'll talk about that one another time. The reel is closed. Walk well.